Hello everyone. Today we are going to investigate the traditional inflation-money relationship with the context of monetarist and Keynesian approaches. Since we will consider inflation as ever-increasing prices, we need to evaluate how different approaches in economic theory explain this economic phenomenon and establish the money-inflation relationship. This explanation will make it easier for us to understand why the monetary policy followed in the country caused inflation, or in other terms, why a monetary policy that would cause inflation in the country was implemented. In this context, we are going to analyze two different approaches, traditional approaches, namely monetarist and Keynesian approaches. Let's begin with the monetarist approach. As you can remember from aggregate supply, aggregate demand analysis, monetarist economists argued that only money supply changes were effective in shifting the aggregate demand curve. Therefore, let's first analyze the result of the constantly increasing money supply by using monetarist analysis through a figure. Initially, the economy is at point 0 and the output level at this point is at the natural level and the prices at P0 level, the intersection point of the aggregate demand and aggregate supply curves. If the money supply increases steadily throughout the year, the aggregate demand curve shifts to the right and becomes AD1. In the first stage, the economy may shift to the point 0A for a very short period of time, and the output can rise above the natural level. However, as unemployment falls below the natural level, weights will rise and the aggregate supply curve will begin to shift to the left immediately. This shift will end when the aggregate supply curve becomes AS1. At this point, the economy will return to its natural output level on the long-run aggregate supply curve. In the monetarist analysis, the aggregate supply curve can immediately shift to AS1 position, as workers and firms can expect an increase in money supply. Thus, expected inflation will be higher. In such a case, it will be very fast for the economy to reach the point 1, and the economy will not need to exceed the natural production level. Other evidence presented by the theory of rational expectations for this type of scenario will be discussed in our next lecture. In the new equilibrium point, namely point 1, the general level of prices increases from P0 to P1. If the money supply continues to increase in the next year, the aggregate demand curve will slide again to the right and become AD2. Following this, the aggregate supply curve will shift to the left and reach AS2 from AS1. As a result of this change, the economy will shift to point 1A and then point 2. In the last equilibrium point reached, the general level of prices also rises to P2. If money supply continues to increase in the following years, the same scenario is applied. The economy will be in equilibrium at higher price level. As long as the money supply continues to increase, this process will continue and inflation will occur in the economy. Could there be any other reason for the continuously increasing prices apart from monetary expansion, according to monetarist economists? The answer to this question is no. In monetary analysis, the only factor causing the aggregate demand curve to shift is money supply. Therefore, there is no other factor that moves the economy from point 0 to point 1 and from there to point 2 and beyond. According to monetarist analysis, the main factor underlying rapid inflation is a rapid monetary expansion. In the Keynesian approach, the continuously increasing supply of money will create the same effects on the aggregate supply and aggregate demand curves that we consider in the figure we have already analyzed. In other words, aggregate demand curve will continue to shift to the right and then aggregate supply curve to the left. The only difference between two approaches is that Keynesians regard the displacement speed of the aggregate supply curve is slower than monetarists. Therefore, according to Keynesian economists, the economy can stay longer than its natural output level than the monetarists suggest. The result is the same as the result of the monetarists. The rapidly increasing money supply will cause to increase continuously and rapidly, thereby creating inflation. Could there be another reason for increasing prices in the Keynesian analysis other than money? The answer to this question is no. This answer may surprise you, as we have seen in our previous statements that other factors such as fiscal policy and supply shocks other than money supply are effective on aggregate demand and aggregate supply curves, according to the Keynesian analysis. In order to understand why Keynesian economists see high inflation as a monetary concept, let's examine whether other factors will create inflation in the absence of a high monetary expansion. These factors include fiscal policy measures, expectations for future, and negative supply shocks. Let's begin with the fiscal policy and inflation. Is fiscal policy is the reason for inflation? To answer this question, let's analyze the figure on the screen, which shows the effect of a one-time increase in government spending, for example, from 500 million to 600 million liras. Let's assume that economy was at the 0 point in the beginning. The output was at the natural output level and prices at the P0 level. The increase in public spending brings the aggregate demand curve to AD1 and the economy shifts to 0A point. The point realized at this point, the output realized in this at this point Y0A is above the natural production level Yn. In this case, the aggregate supply curve will shift to the left and become AS1. At the intersection point of AS1 and AD1 curves, point 1, output will return to natural level and prices will increase to P1 level. The net result of a one-time increase in public spending was a one-time increase in the general level of prices. In the meantime, how does the inflation rate change? Prices increase from point 0 to point 0A and then from there to point 1. However, when the point 1 is reached, the price increase rate decreases to 0. Accordingly, a one-time increase in public spending leads to a one-time increase in prices and in the rate of inflation, and does not cause inflation in terms of steadily increasing prices. If public spending continues to increase, we may encounter continuously increasing prices. In such a situation, we might think that Keynesian analysis opposes the view that inflation is the result of monetary growth rate. However, you should remember that a policy such as the continuously increasing public spending is not applicable. There is a limit to public spending that can be made. Government cannot spend all of its gross domestic product. In fact, long before it reaches this limit, the political process will stop the increase in public spending. As the ongoing debate on balanced government budget and public spending in Parliament shows, both the public and politicians have a target level in public spending that they consider to be affordable. Although there are minor deviations from targets, large deviations will not be allowed. In fact, public pressure and political pressures can seriously restrict the public spending. How can the other aspect of fiscal policy, we mean taxes, be effective in this regard? Can the continuous reduction of taxes cause inflation? The answer to this question is again no. The figure on the screen can also be used as a figure showing the effect of a one-time decline in taxes on output and prices. As a result of analysis, a one-time increase in prices will occur. We can see that prices continue to increase by reducing taxes more. However, this process must absolutely stop, because when the taxes are zero, it will not be possible to decrease them further. In this case, according to Keynesian analysis, fiscal policy alone cannot cause inflation. Expectations on business life and inflation also states that the expectations about business life, as you know, Keynes called this factor as the animal spirits, cannot cause inflation alone. Although the optimism of consumers and businesses which caused an increase in spending may cause a one-time shift in aggregate demand and temporary inflation, it cannot cause permanent shifting of the aggregate demand curve and continuously increasing prices. Because consumers and businesses cannot increase their spending continuously, just like the government, animal spirits cannot create inflationary process alone. How about supply side shocks? As supply shocks and workers' efforts to increase wages shift the aggregate supply curve to the left, you might think that these supply side factors may cause inflation. However, we can show that your opinion is not correct. For example, let's assume that we are facing a negative supply shock, such as the oil embargo that leads to an increase in oil prices. As you see in the figure, the negative supply shock will shift aggregate supply curve from AS0 to AS1. If the money supply remains constant, the aggregate demand curve AD0 will not change and the economy will shift to 0 point. The production is Y0 realized at this point is below the natural output level and the annual level of price is higher than the before, P0A. Since the unemployment rate realized in such a situation is higher than the natural unemployment rate, the aggregate supply curve will return to AS0 position. The economy will slide down on the AD0 curve and return to point 0 again. The net result of the supply shock is to return to the original production and price levels. As it's seen, inflation did not occur. Additional negative supply shocks will again shift the aggregate supply curve to the left and the result will be the same again. Prices temporarily rise, but inflation will not occur. We can summarize our result as follows. Supply-side factors cannot be the source of inflation alone. Supply-side factors that change the level of natural production can create a one-time permanent increase in prices. However, this does not mean a continuous increase in prices, that is inflation. The aggregate supply, aggregate demand analysis that we have discussed up to now shows that the monetarist and Keynesian views regarding the inflationary process are not very different. Both views believe that a high inflation occurs with a high monetary expansion rate. Given that we mean the continuously and rapidly increasing prices with the word of inflation, we can say that many economists agree with Winton Friedman, inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. There is a question we should answer in this case, in this situation. Why monetary policy occur in the economy? Although we know that it takes to be a rapid inflation, rapid monetary expansion, we cannot fully understand inflation until we understand why the inflationary monetary policy has emerged. If everyone agrees that inflation is not a good thing for the economy, why are we facing such a problem so often? Why do governments follow monetary policies that will cause inflation? Since inflation is not a desirable event and the rapid monetary expansion that causes inflation does not emerge on its own, inflationary policies must be emerging while trying to achieve other goals. Under this title, we will analyze government policies that may be the source of inflation. The first target followed by many governments and often resulting in inflation is to achieve higher employment. For example, the central bank has been tasked with promoting high employment because of the task of supporting economic growth in the law of the central bank in many countries. In such legal arrangements, it states that the central bank will pursue monetary policy that will ensure an employment level consistent with a stable price level. But in practice, governments have turned to the goal of achieving their employment target by paying less attention to the effects of their policies on inflation. This was especially true in developing countries for the period 1960 and 1990, and governments began to take a more active role in the economy to reduce unemployment. The fact that the public authority plays a more active role in the economy in order to reduce unemployment is called activist economic policy. An activist stabilization policy pursued to achieve high employment may result in two types of inflation. Of these, cost-push inflation, or only cost inflation, arises due to negative supply shocks or when workers raise wages to high level. The other type of inflation is demand pull inflation or only demand inflation and occurs when those who make economic policy decisions follow policies that shift the aggregate demand curve to the right continuously. We can use aggregate supply, aggregate demand analysis to understand how the goal of achieving higher employment can lead to both types of inflation. Let's begin with the cost-pushed inflation. According to our figure, the economy is initially at the 0 point where the AD0 aggregate demand curve and AS0 aggregate supply curve intersect. Let us assume that in such a situation, workers decide to raise wages because they want to raise real wages or do not want to real wages to fall due to high inflation expectations. With the effect of this increase in wages, the aggregate supply curve will shift to the left and become AS1. This decrease in aggregate supply may be caused not only by high wage demands, but also by firms' desire to sell goods at high prices or negative supply shocks. If there is no change in the monetary and fiscal policies monitored, the economy will shift to the zero A point where the AS1 aggregate supply curve and AD0 aggregate demand curve intersect. In this case, the actual production Y0A will fall below the natural output level and the prices will increase to P0A. What can decision makers who aim to provide high employment in such an environment and therefore pursue an activist policy do? Due to the decrease in production and thus the increase in unemployment, decision makers will follow policies to shift the aggregate demand curve to AD1. Thus, the economy will return to the level of natural output and therefore natural unemployment level. In other terms, shift to point 1 in the figure, and prices will rise to P1. Workers who have increased their wages will not complain about this situation. The government intervened to ensure that there was no excess unemployment and workers received high wages. An activist policy with a high employment target is often called an accommodating policy, as the government surrenders to the high wage demands of workers. Workers whose requests are accepted once are encouraged to demand an even higher wage increase. On the other hand, other workers may start to think that their wages are low compared to the wages of their friends receive, and they may request that their wages be increased as they do not want to be left behind. The result is that aggregate supply curve shifts to the left and becomes AS2. Thus, the economy shifts to point 1A and unemployment rises above the natural level. Activist policies will once again be applied in order to shift the aggregate demand curve to the right and turn into AD2, thereby bringing the economy back to the full employment at a price level like P2. If this process continues, the results will be a continuous increase in the general level of prices. We mean cost inflation. What is the role of monetary policy in cost inflation? The aggregate demand curve must shift continuously to the right for cost inflation to occur. In Keynesian analysis, changing the total demand curve to AD1 position for the first time can be achieved by increasing public expenditures once or decreasing taxes once. But what will be the source of subsequent shifts in the aggregate demand curve? With the maximum amount of public expenditure and the minimum tax amount, the aforementioned limitations imply that the expansionary fiscal policy cannot be used for a long time in order to continuously shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. The aggregate demand curve can be shifted to the right continuously by continuously increasing the money supply. We mean actualizing a higher monetary expansion rate. Therefore, cost inflation is a monetary concept. Cost inflation cannot emerge without the accommodating monetary policy of authorities that accept a high rate of monetary expansion. Now we can discuss the demand pull inflation. The aim of achieving high employment level may lead to inflationary monetary policy in another way. Even if the economy is at full employment, some unemployment will still be found due to disruptions in the labor markets. These labor market failures prevent the matching of existing unemployed and current vacancies. For example, an auto worker who is unemployed in Bursa may be unaware of the job opportunity opened in the electronics industry in Istanbul. Even if he is knowledgeable about this job, he may not want to move to Istanbul or like to retrain. Therefore, the unemployment rate will be greater than zero when the economy is in full employment. If those who make economic policy decisions set a very low unemployment target, this will bring up a faster monetary expansion pace and ultimately inflation, as the target is lower than the natural unemployment rate. We can show how this can happen by using the aggregate supply and aggregate demand analysis that you see on the screen. If decision makers have a lower unemployment rate target, let's say 4% than the natural unemployment rate, it is generally estimated as 5.5% for developed countries today. They must ensure that production is realized at a higher level than the natural output level in order to achieve this goal. In the figure, the target production level is shown as YT in order to realize the 4% unemployment rate. Let us assume that the economy was originally at the 0 point, that is, the economy is at the level of natural output. If it is noted level of natural production is lower than the targeted production YT, decision makers have to increase the production to the level of YT in order to achieve the unemployment target of 4%. To achieve this, they will follow policies that increasing aggregate demand. As a result of these policies, the aggregate demand curve shifts to the right until it reaches to AD1 and the economy moves to point 0A. Thus, production reaches the level of YT and 4% unemployment rate goal is achieved. If the unemployment rate selected as the target was between 4.5 and 5.5%, which represents the natural unemployment rate, no problems will arise. However, since the 4% unemployment rate in the YT production level is lower than the natural unemployment rate, weights will increase and the aggregate supply curve will shift to the left and become AS1. Thus, the economy moves from point 0A to point 1. The economy again returns to the natural unemployment rate, but this time equilibrium is at a higher price level at P1. We could conclude our analysis here, but as it's seen, since the current unemployment rate is again higher than the targeted unemployment rate, decision makers will again follow the policies that will move the aggregate demand curve to the right and make it AD2. Thus, the economy will pass the point 1A and the aggregate target output level will be reached. The process discussed up to now will bring the economy to point 0 and prices will increase to P2. The result of these analyses is the ever-increasing prices, and we call this is inflation. With what measures can economic policymakers shift the aggregate demand curve to the right? As we have seen before, fiscal policy cannot be used for this purpose for a long time because there is a limit to increasing public spending and lowering taxes. In this case, they will inevitably have to follow an expansionary monetary policy. The result is a continuous increase in money supply and a rapid monetary expansion. In our explanations above, targeting a very high level of production or a very low unemployment rate is the source of inflationary monetary policy. However, it seems pointless for decision makers to pursue such a policy. In this case, the economy is deprived of the benefits of keeping the production at high level and also under the burden of creating inflation. If decision makers cannot see that the unemployment rate that are targeting is lower than the natural unemployment rate, the process we see in the figure will work until they realize these errors. The inflationary process discussed above is called demand pull inflation because it's caused by the decision makers following policies that shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. Unlike demand pull inflation, cost push inflation was the case when workers increased wages. Is it possible to distinguish between these two types of inflation in practice? The answer to this question will be no. As we can see, both types of inflation occur with high monetary expansion. Therefore, it will not be possible to distinguish these two types of inflation by looking at the monetary expansion rate. However, according to the figures we analyzed, demand pull inflation occurs at times when the unemployment rate is lower than the natural unemployment rate, and cost push inflation occurs at times when the unemployment rate is higher than the natural unemployment rate. In order to decide what type of inflation occurs, it is necessary to look at whether the current unemployment rate is higher or lower than the natural unemployment rate. If economists and decision makers knew how to measure the natural unemployment rate, this would be a quite easy task. However, this extremely difficult research problem has not yet been fully resolved by economics. Beyond that, the difference between cost push inflation and demand pull inflation has become more and more blurred because demand inflation can cause cost inflation to begin. When prices increase due to demand inflation, expected inflation will increase. This will cause workers to demand higher wages and thus real wages to drop. In this way, demand pull inflation can initiate cost push inflation. In today's course, we analyzed the traditional relationship between inflation and money supply and the types of inflation. I strongly suggest to read the course notes with a great careful to understand this process easily. See you next week.